Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is co-host Daniel McAdams. And Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Good. We have a bit of news today that came out yesterday. The Russians have announced that they're taking out their Air Force. They had 45 aircraft there. They've been doing a lot of bombing. Things have changed. They were there for less than 6 months, a little over 5 months. And now the negotiations are going on, and there's lots of talk. Who's in the driver's seat now? But it certainly looks like the Russians are in a pretty good position. For the United States is involved, but it looks like they're going to be involved. So the big question is, the announcement is the Russians are leaving. They're taking out their Air Force. Are we to expect now that the Russians are leaving? Do you think we'll leave Syria as well?
Well, that's a big question, and it was a surprise announcement. Nobody really expected it, but Russian President Putin said that our tasks are generally fulfilled in Syria. Remember, Russia was invited into Syria by the Syrian government back in September to help fight against ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which is known as al-Nusra in Syria. And so they ran thousands of sorties bombing ISIS and al-Nusra, and what looked like the imminent collapse of the Syrian government has now put President Assad in a much better position. A lot of the villages and cities, including even Aleppo, which is really the main city in Syria, is on the verge of being liberated from ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So apparently Russia feels like the sorties that it's flown have done their job, and it's not a complete withdrawal. It's a withdrawal of the active troops. They'll still maintain their air base that they've had since 1972, I believe, in Tartus, and they'll also maintain an air base, a naval base in Tartus and air base in Latakia.
Our argument, along with some of our allies like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, are arguing that Russia really, they weren't doing what they said they were doing. They said that that they were mainly going after ISIS, and they did. But our argument, or our side and our allies, said, oh no, they weren't really going after ISIS. They were going after the rebels. But quite frankly, I would think that the Russians had no real reason, to distinguish. We can't distinguish from them. We send support over there. We can't go to John McCain and ask him to tell us who the moderates are.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So we've been in there, and right now, it looks like things are changing. The negotiations are going on, which is good, and maybe there will be less fighting, but there's still a long way to go. But, there's been disorder there for a good while, but the real war has been going on, since 2011 when Obama announced Assad has to go. And even some who are participating in these negotiations are still saying that. So they have a long way to go. But if nothing else, I think this shows that the Russians won this skirmish, how it settles down and how it works out. But it certainly wasn't the neocons who were agitating for actually accelerating. There was some suggestion that maybe we would do some secret bombing or hidden bombing and try to put more pressure on Assad to leave. So I think that side has lost for now.
Yeah, what you're mentioning was a big article and interview with President Obama in The Atlantic, and there were many, many revelations, but one of the most shocking was that Kerry had tried to talk Obama early on into launching a few missiles. He said, quietly launch a few missiles to send a message to Assad that we mean business and that he needs to step down. And if you think about war crimes and international terrorism, the idea of quietly sending missiles to blow up part of a country that you're not at war with to send a message, it just seems, so I think it shows the ugly side of John Kerry. Of course, thankfully, Obama didn't take his advice.
Well, the prediction of Obama was that if Russia comes in, they'll end up in a quagmire, and that's the last thing they've ended. It seems like they may well have learned their lesson, from Afghanistan. It looks like we haven't learned any lessons. There was a time when we thought the United States learned a lesson in Vietnam and that we shouldn't get carelessly involved in unconstitutional no-win wars where we didn't have a real stake in it. And yet here we go. We're the interventionists. And in this sense, I think that they're more realistic about what they can do or can't do. And it looks like we are determined one way or the other to defend this empire. this backing off raises questions on, who's really going to win. But the Russians, even though you explained that they've been invited in, they also have a strategic interest. They have one naval base in the whole Mediterranean, and we have, we can't even count all the naval and air bases we have around the world. We're in 150 countries, and we have troops everywhere, and we have literally troops in Syria, not Army combat troops, but we have special forces. We have CIA in there, and others who use our weapons, do some bombing and killing, and it goes on. So we're very much involved. And right now, al-Nusra says that they aren't going to hold back. They're still waiting. They still have to get rid of Assad. So there's a ways to go on this, but maybe the Congress will straighten this out. Maybe they will introduce a resolution. Usually we see these resolutions all the time, but they did have a resolution yesterday that sort of coincided with this, and they put the blame, I think, a little bit more on Russia. It wasn't even-handed.
Yeah, as you remember from all your years there, they're always a day late and a dollar short. So this is, these sensational changes happen, and here's Congress fighting the last war. H-Con Res 121, introduced by your old friend Chris Smith, no friend of peace. But the funny thing about it, and we should say that there were sadly only 3 no's on this, but some of our friends voted no. Thomas Massey voted no, great courageous vote. Justin Amash, and our new friend Tulsi Gabbard, who's been very good on this. Yeah, but so much of this bill was just patently false, objectively and patently false. Just a couple of things I'll go over quickly. It's just ridiculous. Assad has engaged in widespread torture and rape and employed starvation as a weapon of war, including chemical weapons, which the U.S. now even admits were not used by Assad in that August. As a matter of fact, the U.S. military said just the other day that actually the rebels have been using chemical weapons, including very recently. No mention of that in the bill. The vast majority were killed by the Syrian government. It's not true. And here's a good one. You'll appreciate this. It accuses Russia of violating international law by deliberately bombing civilian infrastructure. Now, the word deliberate is interesting because how could they know, for one? And two, they've never proven that any of this has happened. And third, when you want to talk about violating international law, the fact that the U.S. started bombing Syria without a UN resolution, without any authorization, without being invited in, these are all violations of international law.
And when you raise this question about infrastructure, just think of the infrastructure and historic sites that were destroyed, with our bombing of Iraq. And I just can't get over the fact that the administration admitted that there were 500,000 children probably died from our bombing and killing
sanctions,
in Iraq. And yet here they come along and making these accusations, and yet we admitted to that. But it's interesting about the definitions. If we have a policy that we bomb and we strategically bomb, and we have no intention of killing anybody innocent, even though there is a candidate that said we should intentionally kill relatives of the suspect. So, but there's collateral damage, and a lot of innocent people die, and the policies kill a lot of people. But it's very easy to see when the other side kills some people that it's automatic and genocide. I mean, it may be bad, it may be horrible, and you don't want to defend them, but in comparison, it just seems so strange. And that's why I think we continue to lose credibility. The American people are waking up. They don't believe our government anymore, especially when the government tells them everything is okay, there's no problems with the economy and no inflation and jobs are okay, this sort of thing. But they don't seem to have as much interest in the lies told on foreign policy. This is not going to be news. They're not. The American people. Do you think they're going to bring it up in the next debate?
No.
About this, because both sides are in favor of a form of intervention. And there's no question about that. They just think that one side said, well, they just mismanaged. They should have hit this target, not that target. And others are saying, well, you just need a lot more airplanes. You need a lot more troops. It's always all arguing about, the technique and the management of it. And yet the lies are continually be told, as you said. And there will be very few people will question that. And of course, this is where the violence is. And we've been talking about the violence happening in this campaign. It's nothing compared to the violence that our own government participates in and precipitates a lot of violence, because ongoing violence is in many places, and we've been very much involved in the last 15 years.
The other question is, how can we have a rational foreign policy when we can't base it on facts? Here's another thing from the resolution that is it's just stupid. He said one of the claims is the attacks of the Syrian government have led to the expansion of ISIS. How does that make sense? In what way, in what world does it make sense that them fighting ISIS leads to the expansion of ISIS? Maybe because ISIS is stealing all the weapons we're sending to the moderates. But here, we always look to the resolve clauses because that's where the meat is. And this is something that I think may be a red flag. And it urges the administration to establish additional mechanisms for the protection of civilians. And so that almost sounds to me like authorizing a no-fly zone or something. So I started wondering if the Russians do pull out, are the neocons in Washington going to take this as the excuse to finally go in big?
Of course, this isn't official authority, but it's sort of setting the stage for it, because I remember very clearly a couple years before you came to the office, 1998, there was a resolution like this on I think it was the Iraqi Freedom Act or something, but it set the stage, and even then I said this is going to lead to war, and of course it did. So, but these resolutions, even though they're late and they're mischievous and they don't tell the truth, they're significant because they're preparing the people for, and maybe someday getting a UN resolution for no-fly zones. And I think some of the candidates are all for that, on both sides would support a no-fly zone, always believing, that you can fight pseudo wars and we'll never lose anybody and we can quickly win and that sort of thing. But looking back again about the relationship of Russia with Syria, it's been long-term. And Russia has a naval base that I mentioned at Tartus, and that's important to them. I would think, see if you think it's a fair comparison. What if the government of Cuba had been a little stronger, a little more bold, and said, okay, we're going to take over our base at Guantanamo. But, that would have been the limit. There'd be no way. But I think, in a way, they've had this naval base. It's been an agreement. What they have is probably more legal than the way we had Guantanamo. I think we used a little bit of force to take over Guantanamo.
And if you look at the original agreement, it specifically forbade the kind of activity that went on in Guantanamo with the detention of prisoners. So even that signed 100 and some years ago is made null and void by U.S. actions in Guantanamo.
Right, and I wished we could be very optimistic and say that this is all going to be resolved, but quite frankly, there's a long way to go. But I think it's positive. And I don't think either side is a non-interventionist. I don't think the Russians are non-interventionists, but it seems like they have a little bit more finesse, a little bit more knowledge, and a little bit more caution, and a little bit more justification, because they have followed international law somewhat better than our side has.
Well, it seems like they must have better advisors. Washington is full of neocons who know very little about these areas, but they have a lot of ideas how the world should be. And I think, the Russians had a particular strategy. You talk about the criticism of them not hitting ISIS at first, but they wanted to free up the Western corridor and break the ISIS supply lines before they finally went to the eastern part and started bombing in Raqqa and Aleppo. So they had a strategy. But now the next track is going to be Geneva and the political track. And there is an opposition group, the High Commission, and the government. The question now is, with the ceasefire holding and these talks beginning, I think, today again, will this lead to some sort of a political solution where truly moderate rebels, those who don't want to fight their way to overthrow, will find some sort of an agreement, have some significant reforms, in Syria that will please the opposition and will enable them to unite and get rid of these last vestiges of terrorist groups that we admit are terrorist groups?
They're in no man's land as far as negotiations go, because they are doing something illegally because they don't have the authority, and the UN's not going to give them authority, because the Security Council is not going to do it. I doubt if NATO is all of a sudden going to say we have to all of a sudden do this or put troops in. And yet the NATO people are certainly part of the problem, as they were in Ukraine, and they're part of the problem, in the whole area, because we use them as our own military force, and we always threaten them. So I think that the authority, they might say, why doesn't the Congress come up with the authority? But that's not likely either, because now they're moving into negotiations. And even before the negotiations, there was a request for the authority to use military force, because they were still using the authority to go after those who were responsible for 9/11. But they live outside the law, so they're not going to do that. So I don't think the Congress is going to react and say, this is what we give you authority to do. I think it's still going to be this mishmash. But in the meantime, if there's less fighting and killing and negotiations going on, that's certainly better than the acceleration of the military forces.
Sure, and let's not forget, I think there are some significant political changes happening in Europe right now. The German elections, regional elections over the weekend, produced a very surprising anti-Merkel response result. So I think the citizens of Europe are getting frustrated with their leaders who kowtow to the U.S. and NATO all the time. So in this sense, the Putin move may be a very clever propaganda ploy to win over the citizens of Europe, to pressure their leaders to step back from Washington's neocon games.
Yeah, and I think that last point you made, Daniel, is probably very, very significant, because Europe's in turmoil. The European Union's about to break up, and it is related to what's going on in the Middle East and the refugees flowing in. And also, it's related to economic policies of these various countries, where it creates poverty, and they don't like their dictatorships, and they're vulnerable to outsiders coming in, and, like us, that come in and say, well, we're going to help you with your rebellion against your government. So those conditions are up for grab right now. But on top of it all, I believe our country, in particular, in the whole world, is facing the disintegration of a philosophy of globalism, and also the philosophy of Keynesian economic policy, which has failed. And just like the communist or socialist economies always fail, we're seeing this failure. So I think all of this is part of a big change that we're in the middle of, and also the reason you don't see anybody talking about it, and they come up with no answers. They're not touching on it, and they're fighting among themselves instead of struggling and debating the ideas of what brought us to the brink here, what economic policy and monetary policy and foreign policy has brought us to the brink. But no, it's boiled down to a lot of bickering and talking about, I can run things better than you can run things, and I'm a tougher guy than you are, and I don't see any answers there whatsoever. But I do see an answer coming, because the system we have is going to fall apart, and is going to give an opportunity to those of us who believe in individual liberties and free markets and property, because that offers, a chance for us to change the conditions of the world and bring about much better opportunity for peace and prosperity, obviously the goals we seek. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.